Our first presenter is Professor Nayanjot Lahiri, who, as Liz mentioned, is the keynote speaker at the Association of Asian Studies meeting this year, and we are very lucky to have with us, at the very least, as an excuse to bring us together, and I'm sure will be a very stimulating contributor to this conversation. She's professor of history at Ashoka University, and her interests include ancient India, Indian archaeology, and heritage studies. She's author and editor of a number of books, a few of which I'll list here. They include Priya Ahomasam, The Archaeology of Indian Trade Routes up to 200 BC, Finding Forgotten Cities, How the Indus Civilization Was Discovered, a book that I found very stimulating in some of my own work, Marshalling the Past, Ancient India and Its Modern Histories, and Ashoka in Ancient India. She's presently working on a history of Indian archaeology since independence, and is a person who has had a great influence on influence on the field as it's developed both in India and around the world. So please join me in welcoming Professor Nayanjot Lahiri as our first presenter.
I'm deeply honored to be here today, and thank you, Dr. Perry, for this invitation for the roundtable being hosted by the Harvard-Yenching Institute, with whom I have an association that goes back to 2006, and I actually have very happy memories of the time I spent at Harvard thanks to the Institute. And that was when I got to know Ron Flood, who actually educated me on a number of occasions on the archaeology of China and on what I should read around that. So it's great that you are actually moderating this panel. I also see this as a wonderful opportunity to get a sense of the zones of conflict around archaeology in different parts of Asia, about which actually I have very little knowledge, just sort of less than a working knowledge, and how those are actually similar and different from the disputes in South Asia, which is the focus of my opening remarks today. How have mundane iron fragments in North India become the object of scholarly disagreement? Why, for instance, has the archaeological presence of writing in South India in the beginning of the first millennium BC, which is based on scientific dates, why has this failed to convince the high priests of history there? Did the Buddha live in the 6th century BCE or the 5th century BCE? And is the controversy over the Indus civilization and the culture reflected in the Rig Veda about whether these were separate entities or manifestations of the same phenomenon a new argument, or is it part of a much older one? These are some of the questions that I'll range across in these 10 minutes. But at the outset, what I want to underline is that the public life of archaeology in India has actually been marked by disputes from the 19th century onwards, much before the discipline became researchable in the realm of academia. One needs to only read the 1884 edition of the architectural historian James Ferguson's tract, which was called Archaeology in India, with special reference to the works of Rajendra Lal Mitra, to get a sense of this. Rajendra Lal Mitra was a very distinguished Indian scholar who had worked extensively on architecture and on archaeology. But Ferguson's critique of his work was not meant to be an intellectual give and take among scholars. Instead, it was actually offered to combat the Ilbert Bill in India, which aimed to allow Indian judges to try not just Indians, but Europeans as well. And as James Ferguson himself tells us, he says that he wrote this book to demonstrate, by dissecting the writings of the archaeological writings of an Indian scholar, he proposed to demonstrate that even the most educated of Indians were actually intellectually and morally unfit to be treated as equals by Europeans. So there's a long history of archaeological work becoming the subject of controversies. And while archaeologists must carry on their own work in their own low-key way, the squabbles that result around their work make one wonder, whether we are really talking about the ancient past or whether it concerns a much larger and sometimes a political black and white canvas. Now, to look at some of the recent controversies, several of the discoveries around which there have been vibrant debates relate actually to the transformations in the chronology of key indicators. So if you take the case of iron technology in India, since the 1970s, its presence actually has been continuously consolidated. In 1976, for instance, iron fragments were actually found at a site of the Indus civilization called Allahadino in Pakistan. But it is more recently that the occurrence of iron in 2nd millennium BCE contexts in the Gangetic plains has created a huge stir. And one of those sites happens to be Malhar, which has not just provided a range of iron objects, but also evidence of iron working. And interestingly, one of those objects is an iron plowshare, which underlines that iron began to be used in agriculture in this part of the Gangetic plains by 1700 BC or so. Now, why should this actually become such a major source of controversy? This has become a major source of controversy because it negates the connections that many have made between iron technology and social change. Actually, major economic and social change took place not in the 2nd millennium BCE, but in the 1st millennium BCE, around the 6th century BCE, when cities, the rise of new political formations, as also, new philosophies, all these, come together. And of course, all of this is girded by a very secure agricultural base. Now, as long as the antiquity of iron hovers around 800, 700 BCE, there's actually a way in which you can show these changes as flowing from the presence of iron. But if you're actually pushing this back, the presence of iron to the 2nd millennium BCE, that whole sort of scheme gets completely disturbed. Now, why the scheme should be so influential has to do with the ideas of Gordon Childe and the influence of those ideas on, left-leaning liberal scholars who've been, notwithstanding the fact that this no longer stands to historical scrutiny, still feel very convinced by the notion of a neatly ordered succession of events working in tandem with technological change. The antiquity of the major script of ancient India, the Brahmi script, is another instance of an influential part of the academy being very hesitant to accept the implications of archaeological research which push back accepted chronological parameters. Now, very early dates, to put it very quickly, have come out of excavations done in South India by Professor K. Rajan of the Pondicherry University at places like Kodumanal and Porunthal. The earliest of those dates hover around the 5th century BCE. These are AMS dates from 2 laboratories abroad. The dates come from well-stratified complexes that have provided a large number of potsherds like this, potsherds which just don't bear graffiti only, but also characters of the Brahmi script. What is also very interesting is that below the level which, provided the earliest dates, there's a 65 centimeter thick cultural deposit which contains more inscribed potsherds. So actually the dates may be pushed back and they could be as early as the 6th century BCE. Now, this has actually created a huge discomfort among epigraphists and historians. I find this actually very curious because usually people feel, completely glorify in the idea of pushing back the antiquity of a particular element of the ancient past. But if you read Rajan's book, and you read the foreword, which was written by Professor Y. Subarayallu, who's a hugely respected epigraphist, he asks, and I quote, whether we have, as of now, solid evidence to speculate and build a huge new edifice ignoring the hitherto established facts in Indian historiography. Now, what are these established facts that Subarayallu is talking about? I think the bottom line is that this cannot be squared up with a view that all civilization moved in India from the north to the south. So the point that Professor Subarayallu is making is that if the archaeological evidence for writing in North India goes back to the 3rd century BCE, then this evidence, notwithstanding the AMS dates, should actually be later than what Rajan has provided. Of course, in this, the evidence, the literary and the paleographic evidence, which for at least the last 100 years has pointed to the possibility of writing in the north going back to as early as the 5th century BCE, has been completely ignored. To then look at certain old disputes from this, which every few decades get new life breathed into them. How an older controversy can be brought back to life in the light of archaeological discoveries relates to the date of the Buddha. This is one example that I thought I would speak about, especially the date of his death or Mahaparinirvan. Again, for more than 100 years, there are those who have argued that the Buddha actually lived for most of his life in the 6th century BCE, but there are others who have placed him in the 5th century. Most recently, excavations were conducted by the Pashupati Archaeological Trust and the Durham University in Lumbini in Nepal. And beneath the remains of a 3rd century BC brick shrine, the remnants of an older brick shrine were found, and below that, an even older wooden structure. Now, that wooden structure, the radiocarbon dates show that this was built in the 6th century BC. Now, the date of the Buddha is actually different. The whole politics around it, for the reason that there are many countries, such as Thailand, for instance, who have pegged their dating system according to the year of the Buddha's death. So it's not a question of just looking at iron fragments and so on and so forth. Now, after this came out in Antiquity in 2013, you had a lot of reactions. There were scholars like Richard Gombrich and Donald Lopez who dismissed this by doubting whether it was a Buddhist shrine. They felt that it was actually, it could have been a shrine for any religious cult, and it was later retrofitted into a Buddhist shrine. But as the excavators pointed out, that the footprints of the 3 stacked structures actually correspond very closely. So it's likely that they had a similar purpose through the centuries. So I think, although I can't go into it right now, Rowan informed me that I just have a minute, but I think this highlights how ancient history continues to be reticent about incorporating archaeological evidence when it fails to augment interpretations based on texts. And finally, I'll just touch upon this for a few seconds. Like the date of the Buddha, the relationship of the Indus civilization and the Vedic tradition is also not a new debate. This idea actually goes back to 1929 when it was first discussed by Ramaprasad Chanda, and even scholars like Didi Kosambi with a very strong Marxist orientation had no problems in seeing Hinduism in the archaeological evidence of the Harappan civilization. Today, of course, this has become like a bitter custody battle. And in part, I think this is because of, as I've said, an awareness that a lot of Indian history has been presented through the prism of foreign conquests. But I think this is also because of the political investment that has been made in searching out for the archaeological footprints of the Vedic Aryans. So I'm not going to develop this now. Maybe this will come up later. So to just put this all together, some of the questions that strike me with regard to this is A, under what conditions do controversies result in a better understanding of historical phenomena? And do protocols of academic discourse get compromised with political posturing around archaeological questions and discoveries? Thank you.